first of all, let's explain why attachment theory and other childhood trauma theories do not explain addiction, okay? So the easiest way to do that is to look at two sets of figures, which I will put in the description because it would be too dry and boring if I go through them here. I'm going to walk you through it and then I'll put the links down there. So the first piece of stats I would pull up would be US Justice Department stats pertinent to childhood maltreatment, which show the successful conviction of people for childhood maltreatment has increased massively, and correspondingly that rates of childhood maltreatment have declined precipitously since 1990, which is exactly what you would expect. In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, child welfare was not high on the agenda. Even in the Western world, it just wasn't. And in the 70s and 80s, that started to change big time. And by the 1990s, it was having an effect. So just look at the hammering that the Catholic Church and other institutions where abuse was endemic. Look at the hammering that they started to get in the 90s, and it's only gotten stronger since then. Welfare departments, childhood safety, social services departments in the US and the UK and everywhere in the Western world expanded massively in the 80s and 90s and have brought a lot of abusive, not just abusive actual offenders, but also abusive parents, of course, have been brought to book and stopped. Correspondingly, all types of childhood maltreatment are in decline. The same cannot be said for addiction. In the same time period, addiction rates have skyrocketed. So the best place to look at that is the Global Disease Burden study, which I think is being produced in the Lancet, reproduced in the Lancet and other publications. I'll find it and put a link below. So that will tell you that abuse of all drug types is on the increase massively. Now, of course, it's global, whereas the other stats I mentioned were US-based, but here's the thing. China and the Middle East and Russia and those other countries are not really skewing the figures. They are mostly responsible for increased use of tobacco. So, of course, all drugs are in there, not just illicit drugs, tobacco, and alcohol are in there. They are increasing and they are pushing the figures up, but they are not increasing in the West. Tobacco use has been in sharp decline in the West, so that's not skewing the figures. It is predominantly illicit drugs like meth, opioids, still alcohol and cocaine, things like that, as evidenced by the recent opioid epidemic. Obviously, it's the most obvious example of the fact that in the West, abuse of substances is on the increase. It is massively increasing. To which I suppose people would say, yeah, but in what age group? Is this just the old boomers that were addicted before, that were abused in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and have now reached adulthood and they're stuck in heroin addiction and so on and so forth? People brought up in old school children's homes and things like that. No. The age group with the largest increase in addictions and fatalities, and it was measured via a number of metrics to do with substance abuse, overdose deaths, all sorts of health data. And the age group that's the most affected is 20 to 40-year-olds. So the exact generation who would have been children during the 1990s, that decade during which childhood maltreatment was in decline. So if the childhood trauma model were correct, or the first 3 years movement, or attachment theory, where children's brains are damaged by their non-attendant heroin addict mothers, if that were true, then we would be seeing a massive decline in substance abuse starting around 2010 and increasing around 2020 and going down to very, very low levels now. And that's obviously not what we're seeing. We're seeing the precise opposite. So actually, there's an bizarrely, there's actually an inverse relationship here. The more safe, the more secure, the less abusive and the less traumatic our societies in the West become for children, the more we abuse drugs and become dependent upon drugs. Now, I dare say that link is not a direct one. I dare say it's something else that's being thrown out. With all the safety with all of that boon, you know, the boon that we have received from a greater awareness of child maltreatment and many other improvements in Western society, the boons, the rewards that we have experienced because of that, the good things, have also come at a price. There's something else that we've lost, and that is what's heavily implicated in addiction. So it's not childhood trauma and maltreatment. So now let's talk about what happens when you try to bring explorative, excavatory therapy styles with regard to your childhood, the classic Freudian, neo-Freudian childhood trauma model, attachment theory-like verbiage would go something like this. What happened to you? We need to find our childhood adversities, our attachment styles, what happened to us in our childhood through having somewhat adverse experiences, a mother who's distant, a working mother, those types of things. I've got no opinion on any of those things. I'm just saying that those are generally thought to be the things: divorce, bereavement, incarceration, poverty, inequality, deprivation, postnatal depression, substance abuse in mothers, those sorts of things. Quite naturally, people think lead to adulthood addiction. They don't, and not directly. And we know that because 90% of people who had a significant amount of adverse childhood experiences, as proven in the ACE study, did not go on to become addicts. They have an elevated risk, but the vast majority of people with difficult childhoods do not become addicts. They don't even smoke. So again, a tenuous link. But the reason it translates even worse over into what are we going to do about addiction. Not only does it not explain the addiction, but the reason why it's even less useful for recovery from addiction is because recovery from addiction entails changing oneself. And when we are primarily preoccupied with what they did, no matter how dreadful that might have been, it is taking away from the onus of responsibility, which unfortunately is with us by the time we are doing fentanyl, meth, cocaine, and no doubt having a deleterious effect on our own loved ones, including children. So unfortunately, rather cruelly, I suppose, the onus is on us. Right? Now, it could be argued that you could do both. You could start coming in from the cold, as it were, dealing with your addiction by a quick, relatively quick foray into what happened to you. And most good therapists and most good treatment centres will do that, of course. They'll do a life story. You might present in front of a group, explain your background, what happened to you. That is, I hesitate to say a quick catharsis. It's not quite that. It's more of an introduction. Here I am. This is who I am. So that the group and the clinicians can get to know you and know what you've been dealing with. But quite quickly, you will notice addiction-specific clinicians will move quite quickly away from the neo-Freudian navel-gazing, somewhat self-indulgent tendencies to just dig around and excavate in that childhood material. In fact, they might actually deliberately avoid it, because the last thing you want to do is if that stuff is really heavy, the last thing you want to do is open that up during a 4-week treatment episode, or even an 8 or 12-week treatment episode. The general received wisdom back in the day, when rehabs were first running, and certainly also in the 12-step community, is that stuff, if it is real heavy boost trauma, belongs in long-term outpatient psychotherapy, whilst you're also attending a 12-step program for your addictions, not in the inpatient treatment setting. So most addiction clinicians will park that for the time being and proceed immediately to the addiction and what can we do to create cessation of the drug use and abstinence and a clear head and a constructive peer group and a support network and lowering rates of depression and anxiety, because lo and behold, you probably, most of the time, don't have a primary mental health issue going on. It's either been caused or at least greatly exacerbated by the drug and alcohol use. So get rid of the drug and alcohol use first, then see what's left over. In some percentage of people, there will be some primary illness, like depression, that's still there. But in most people, not. In my experience, it clears up slowly, but it does. And then you can see what the lay of the land is. What has ended up happening is that attachment theory, first 3 years movement, ACE-aware movement, childhood trauma theory has invaded the addiction treatment space, both institutional and professional, and also in voluntary mutual aid groups like 12-step groups. The self-obsessed, navel-gazing, developmental obsessed trauma model. What did they do to me? They've caused this. I want some answers from them. Has invaded the space that used to be all about, I have agency. It's on me now to make some changes. Yes, they did those things, but that's not going to help me now. All of that is getting, the waters are getting muddied severely by the overemphasis on childhood trauma, which, I've got to be honest, most of the time is not even as apparent as it would have been 20 years ago anyway, for the precise reasons that I mentioned at the start of the video, which is that childhood maltreatment is greatly in decline. So oftentimes this alleged trauma that ordinary middle class, lower middle class, working class people who've gotten addicted and wound up in a rehab or in a 12-step program and learn online that all of their issues are to do with childhood trauma, an extremely high amount of the time they won't even have any. You know, they've been fairly well brought up, they've had a relatively normal upbringing with nothing particularly untoward occurring, and the few things that might have gone slightly awry have been massively hyperbolized by ideologically driven clinicians that work with them, or by something that they've read online or whatever it is, and it is not helpful, because one of the dynamics in early recovery is to gain some acceptance of the role that we've played in bringing our addiction to the point where it is. And of course, we'll have numerous denial systems to do battle with during that process. Well, I didn't have any choice because of this or that, or rationalizations. I had to do it because of this or that, or legitimizing it. Everybody does it. If you're under as much stress as I would, you'd do it. We already have enough work to do, snipping all of those unhelpful thought distortions out of the way without the massive blame game that is modern trauma therapy. That only makes it even more hard and can have fatal consequences, because if somebody doesn't get a grip of the central part that they have played in causing their addiction, because well-meaning but ideologically driven clinicians or online influencers have persuaded them that it's not primarily them, it's primarily something else that is to blame, they can miss the central point of therapy or recovery, not take significant enough stock of the role that they are playing in causing their own problems, and consequently go out and relapse and potentially end up injured or, you know, extremely unwell or even worse, right? So this stuff has grave consequences. The original method, if you like, of addiction treatment was sequential. We looked at our addiction first, and we looked at any heavy boost, proper PTSD that we might have, or any other primary illnesses that were severe. We looked at those afterwards and treated those ongoingly, usually for several years. The strategy now has switched to the opposite of sequential. I guess you'd call it, what's the word for the opposite of sequential? Happening at the same time. I can't think of the word now. Concomitant or something like that. Comprehensive or inclusive treatment, which purports to treat the addiction and the trauma that almost everybody is assumed to have, but do not have, in my experience, but which in reality is even worse than that. It's usually, forget the addiction, that's not even that important, because the trauma is really important. The trauma is what's causing the addiction. So this is literally what you will hear from, you know, psychological helping professionals who should know better. Trauma causes the addiction, therefore it's the trauma that should be treated. And how are they going to do that? By rooting around in your childhood in a whirlpool kind of a fashion that gets nowhere really, and the only effective therapy for which are non-talk therapies like somatic experiencing or some kind of ludicrous body-based theory where you lie on the ground and shake, or, you know, do cathartic things like sing and scream. It would be funny if it wasn't so tragic and irresponsible and stupid. But that's where we're at. So, yeah, I don't think that the neo-Freudian somatic experiencing, childhood trauma models, neo-Freudian mother-bashing attachment theory models have anything particularly useful to impart to people who've got serious issues with drugs and alcohol. It can't explain your addiction, and it can't help you recover from your addiction. At best, it's an interesting aside or an interesting side note that may, if you have a good understanding of it, that's not hyperbolic and self-indulgent, that is objectively balanced, can be helpful to help your peers, your counselors, your sponsors get to know you. And to some extent, obviously, it's healthy if you can share that information and not have it weighing you down unnecessarily. But it becomes problematic when it is assumed to be the main focus, because it absolutely isn't the main focus of what somebody with significant substance abuse issues should be dealing with. What they should be dealing with first and foremost is not what happened to me, but what am I doing? And where am I going to go now? And for that, we need a somewhat more stoic direction. And that is to be found mostly in things like 12-step programs that will ask you, what sort of level of control do you seem to have over your drugs? Not much, right? So it's in control of you. You're not in control of it. Do you realize that? That's difficult enough to accept. And pretty quickly after that, some kind of insight into one's own character patterns, one's own character traits and behavioral patterns. What am I doing? It's not working. Am I prepared to change it? Can I shift my routines? Can I change my environment? Can I look at how my thinking is not very rational, and am I prepared to evolve my beliefs? Which is not a given. It's tough work. That is really where all the energy needs to go. Yeah. So that's my frank and I hope not too offensive breakdown of why I don't believe that attachment theory or childhood trauma model in general has much to offer recovering addicts.